1.
All right. Let's see. I guess I will call the June 15th work session to order and ask for a motion to approve the agenda.
Move to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All right. Just a few framing comments this evening. Thank you all for participating last Wednesday in the work session, or last Tuesday on the work session, specifically about our plans for re-entry this fall. I know we had a deep dive into the planning that Roxana and her team have been doing, and Amber and her team have been doing, and a number of other departments and implications. I think tonight I'd like to pull us out a little bit from the specifics and remember that there are a number of levels of decision making that need to happen with this situation right now. We, as the board, have some decisions that we're going to have to make on behalf of our school district community. We have some decisions that are going to be made for us by either the state or the local government, and some decisions that we're going to have to turn over to our really high quality staff and team. And so I think tonight for us to all kind of keep that, as well as our not so old, but still getting used to equity policy and thinking about, as we're making decisions tonight, who is going to be most impacted by these decisions, if there are folks who are differently impacted, and if those folks are being engaged in the decision making in ways that we want to see them be engaged in the decision making. And so with that, you'll see the agenda tonight kind of hits on a couple of topics. Certainly want to also make sure if there are some lingering questions that folks had from last week's meeting. I know, again, a lot of information, a lot of new information, a lot of information to digest. And so I kind of want to just put it at the top of the agenda here too. If there's any kind of burning questions, we might not answer those right in this moment, but to kind of get those voiced so that our admin team makes sure that they work that in as they, get into some of the more specifics this evening. So before we dive into the looking at kind of our preliminary results from the surveys, just wanted to see if there were things that folks have been thinking about since last week, or things that they want to put on the table kind of here at the top. All right, well, again, there's a lot of good stuff happening, and we'll be open to questions as we go along here too. So I guess with that, I'm gonna turn it over to whoever's handling the preliminary survey results. I don't necessarily see a name here, so go ahead, Karen, or whoever.
I think that would be me. So these are preliminary results. The survey does not close until next Wednesday, but I thought you might be interested that to date we had 451 parents that have already taken the survey, 106 staff members, and 112 students. So we have had a relatively high response rate. Of those respondents, 73% of parents are pre-K through grade 6 parents. And most of the student respondents are grades 6 through 12. So we've kind of got opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of respondents. 99% of all respondees said they did have Wi-Fi access in their home. And 40% said that they had 2 or more people sharing a device. So that tells us something about our accessibility, at least from the folks who've responded to the survey. And I know Chris, as I said last week, is working on that. Across all groups, I would say 80+% agreed that MRH did provide education in some ways to benefit children. 40% of parents, though, are worried that the long-term closure is causing their children to fall behind. From these preliminary surveys, we also found out some things about busing. So parents, of the parents that were surveyed, 40% or more, 40 to 45% said that their students rode the bus last year, but only 29% of them say they're planning on their child riding the bus this year. Students in the same survey, 60% said they rode the bus last year, and 20% or so say they plan on riding this year. So again, these are preliminary numbers, but it looks like the early thought process is fewer people want or will be riding the bus. 60% of parents said that they are a little worried that their kids could get COVID, but 80% said they were worried about the social emotional impact of remaining isolated at home. And we also found out that 35% said they would prefer to keep their children home until there is a cure, but 68% said they really wanted all kids to come back on site in the fall. So you kind of got a mixed bag there. 68% of students said they wanted to return in the fall. Students' ratings of the school district's provision of educational services is slightly higher than the parent rating, and maybe that's a secondary elementary thing. And we have lots of numbers about different aspects of that I won't go into. The staff survey, interestingly enough, we found out that of the staff respondents, 3% of our staff, which I assume is support staff, don't have Wi-Fi at home. So we know that that was a challenge, and also some device access for some of our folks who were being asked to work from home temporarily. We also found out that 70% of them are worried that they may contract COVID, and 85% of them are worried about students' social emotional concerns. 44% of them said they would prefer to work from home until they're secure, but 50% want to return on site, and there was a fairly large number of undecided in that piece as well. So I think, preliminarily we're getting a lot of information. It looked like both students and parents reported that most of our families had food access, housing security, healthcare. So many of those things do not appear to be widespread concerns, although there is some concern that's listed. So more to come when it all comes back, and we'll be able to disaggregate that a little more thoroughly by building as well. But that's what we know so far.
Great. Any questions, concerns, additional observations there?
Roxana, you said that the buildings are kind of looking at this data individually as well, I guess. Are administrators, like principals of the different schools, able to see this data?
They will be. We haven't closed it yet. So until all of them are in, at that point, we'll be able to extract it and separate it by building and by demographic, and then everybody can have access to their building's data.
I was wondering though, like while we're still collecting it, could they maybe see how representative that is across their building? Like if there's anybody that they know has, hasn't responded or anything like that, is there any way that they could provide input in that way?
In terms of who has responded and who has not, we did not set up a survey that was identifiable by family.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, it sounds like we maybe need to hit high school parents a little bit harder, right? And as much as possible, I know probably our younger students are running free now that school is out, but maybe we can do some targeted communications there. As far as I know, generally speaking, we have high level of Wi-Fi accessibility in the district. The survey is mobile enabled, so folks could take it on their cell phone if necessary. Is that a correct assumption?
I would assume so. The platform works on multiple formats. I've not tried to do it though, so I hate to
My
say
house
that without.
mobile.
Yeah, okay, I think SurveyMonkey typically is, yeah. I mean, the other thing, I don't know, I'm just wondering if there's ways to even remind folks in the grab and go, you know, food bags or something too. You know, I don't want to assume that those are families that haven't taken it, but I wonder if that's just another communication vehicle to make sure folks are aware that it's out there. So, I don't know. I'm open to other thoughts about how to analog this digital survey.
Katie, we've used those meal opportunities for other purposes over the past few months. So yeah, that's a completely viable way to reach a whole new sector.
Would it be? It might be possible to use our phone messaging too, if we haven't done that already.
We have not, and it would be.
That's a great idea. Everybody loves the voice of whoever does those robocalls. All right.
Hey, Roxanne, I had a just clarifying question on the ridership, bus ridership. When you said that 45% of the respondents said they rode the bus, but 29% said they'd be riding it this year, is it 29% of the total respondents or 29% of the 45?
We asked, did you ride last year? And
Yeah.
45% said yes. We
Okay.
asked, will you ride next year? And 29% said
Okay.
yes. So that is fewer, but neither of the things you said necessarily.
Yeah, no, because 29% of the 45 would be a much smaller number. That's why I was asking to clarify.
Right, no,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Well, and I assume, Roxana, we don't have any data to see how that 29% drop compares to this time frame in previous years.
Well, I don't know if there's a 29% drop, but 29% of all respondents to the survey said that they would ride, which is fewer than the 40 some odd percent that said they rode last year. So no, I wouldn't have anything to compare that to.
I misspoke. I didn't mean a 29% drop. I meant a drop down to 29%.
Right.
But is that some? I mean, is there seasonality in that? Is that typical or is that atypical?
There is some seasonality in terms of fewer riders in the fall and spring than we have in the winter, correct, Amber? But I don't know that we have asked, did you ride last year? Will you be riding this year before? So I can't really trend that.
That's what I was getting at.
What I could add is that we have been trending to start each school year with about the same amount of riders. Last fall, we had an increase, which was why we came for that additional bus.
Great. Other questions about the preliminary survey results? Although it sounds like it's a pretty darn good representation with the potential of being even better. All right, we'll look forward to digging into that a bit more once the survey's closed. So then we'll move on to the next item on the agenda around district plans and recommendations here. So we spent a fair amount of time last week hearing about the different tiers that are being planned for. And I think Wes's question last week too is one that's still rattling around in my mind. around what are the triggers for various levels. I believe that there are, some of those things that are going to be outside of our control, and there are some of those things that are going to be left up to us. And Karen, I will turn it over to you as far as, some of those questions that you are really needing our input in right now, and some of those things that, are outside of our control or are being handled at other layers within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Katie. So thank you for I don't want to say enduring, sitting through all the weeds of the details of the learning plans. We didn't want to overwhelm you, but yet we wanted you all to know how intricate the planning is going. So I appreciate all the feedback that you all gave in terms of your role and the recommendations that we're going to bring to the group. This is a learning process for all of us as we kind of work through this. So what I would like to do at this point in time is a high level update, because we don't have firm recommendations yet, but we're closer to where we are in terms of learning plans. And then also the health and wellness piece, just where we are with Vince's information. We're not going to do a whole presentation, just high level update, and then where we are, like how we're getting to the point for tier 2 and tier 1 with the learning plans. So actually, let's give Vince the floor right now. Just brief, Vince, brief update. Love you, Vince. Where we are with the mass and in the well checks. So
I've been pretty good about being brief lately anyway. Yeah, so we have, I've been working with the nursing team regularly. I just wanted to give them kudos publicly, because they are, they're kind of off the clock right now, but they're just willing to dive in weekly to meet both with our team and with state level folks, and without even being asked. They're just doing it on their own. So I wanted to give Michelle Davis and Catherine Whitehouse and Angel Goldberg a shout out. They've been doing some great work. What's gobbled up most of our thinking is trying to get some clear recommendations about face coverings and health screenings. We've gotten more clarity about it. Dr. Campbell, our district physician, has been very helpful with that process. We're trying to follow the science. We're trying to balance following the science with sort of practicalities of being open with school. We are waiting for some additional kind of research and guidance from Children's Hospital, who's getting ready to release a back to school document. We don't have to follow it, but we want to see it. And we're also looking at some resources from Forest Park Pediatrics, some pediatric practices in the area to continue to shape our thinking. I think where we sort of are leaning right now with regards to face coverings is having them available for staff, having them available for students, but making them optional for students at this point, but leaning towards making them mandatory for our adult guests and staff. That's kind of where that's our thinking right now, although we haven't made that final recommendation with face coverings. What Dr. Campbell has been helpful in helping us understand is a couple things with regards to that on the science. The face coverings are very protective, both for our staff, both in terms of potentially spreading and receiving COVID-19. So the worry that our staff might have, and adults are more susceptible to COVID-19, there's no question about it, is it gives our staff some protection. Students ages 5 to 18 are not, there are low incident rate of contracting COVID-19, and there's not definitive science about them being carriers at a higher rate. So Dr. Campbell felt comfortable with the plan of having it optional for students and mandatory for staff. What will help us determine that ultimately is whether or not we have a blended learning model or all the students are back in the spaces. So that's the face coverings discussion so far. Health screenings has been similar. Initially, we thought we'd be taking everyone's temperature, no question. But I think now what some of the best practice and guidance is about having some kind of health screening, a questionnaire that both staff, visitors, and students do daily. We're hoping to find some kind of electronic help, some kind of app that'll help us track that information. The reason why temperature checks for all students may not be both practical and effective is because 35% of folks with COVID-19 are afebrile, so they won't have a fever, and it would possibly give us a false sense of security at some great expense and some logistical challenges. So that's kind of where we're at with both face coverings and health screenings. There's additional things that we're diving into that'll probably require less board input, but it's just that we have clear protocols about isolation rooms for students that have any kind of a virus, protocols on when students can return to school, protocols on contact tracing, those kind of things. And we'll just update you that. I think that this is one of those areas that Katie sort of described that your team can make decisions and share with you. I think the board may want to weigh in on the face coverings and health screenings when we make a recommendation on that. So that's kind of where our health team is. And we're going to meet every other Wednesday. And then Michelle Davis has agreed to jump in on the statewide call every other Wednesday. And she's already, on her own initiative, completed a webinar on contact tracing in schools. So they're really doing a great job. You have some good nurses here. I'm just a recorder. They're recording secretaries. That's the role I play with them.
Thanks, Vince. That was very concise. I appreciate that. You really captured that. Are there any questions of where we are with our nursing department?
Do any of our requirements as an employer with our staff run counter to any of those recommendations as it relates to what we do with the kids? You know, I mean, as an employer, there are things that I'm required in some cases in the city or the county to provide if I ask staff to return to an environment inside. Are schools, you know, held to that same standard, and does any of that contradict any of the, you know, kicked around suggestions that we're looking at as far as face coverings and that kind of stuff?
So I'll let Roxanne jump in on the HR side, but my sense is that whatever you require, you have to provide. So if you're requiring face coverings for staff, requiring from students, we absolutely have to provide them. I think that's the tricky part, because you want to do what's in the best interest of everyone that's in your space. So I think on that sense, we would have to provide them if we require them. And we still might want to provide them even if we don't require them, even if we strongly suggest. We still might want to do it as a good faith effort. And I think that it might make some sense to provide them, so in case we have to be nimble and need to pivot towards requiring them. But that's my sense of that. I don't know if Roxanne, you have any other thoughts about it. And obviously we'll run all these plans by our district attorney to get her eyes on it too. And, you know, but any thoughts, Roxanne, you wanted to add to that?
I think what you said is correct. If we require it, we do need to provide them. You know, schools have some broader leeway perhaps than other businesses. However, we want to make sure that we are providing adequate protection. I would think for our nursing staff, absolutely, we have to provide for them, and we have to provide, you know, some additional pieces for them that we don't for the rest of the staff. Most districts are, at this point, at least talking to the HR directors, many of the districts that were on the statewide call last Thursday are providing but not requiring even their staff to wear. And I've not yet figured out what the rationale is behind that. But so folks are kind of leaning in the making things available. But they're saying, at least my colleagues, some of them are saying they're being careful about how they couch those expectations.
I had I think I'm confused a little bit on the mask wearing. The mantra we're hearing, or the current theory we're hearing at a national level, is that the masks are worn for the protection of others. So it would seem to me, that being the case, our elderly population, which is our staff, would want to have the students wearing masks as well. And our doctor apparently has contradictory thoughts on that. Do we have any explanation as to that contradiction?
Yes, and Vince, certainly jump in, but one of the things is that he doesn't think students, particularly younger students, you know, 6th grade and younger, will wear the mask properly, and the constant touching, chewing, dropping, sharing, taking off to eat, laying on the ground could actually pose a higher infection risk than just not wearing them, because there would be less touching of the face. Vince, would you like to add to that?
For the students, He also, so what he said was that, this is what he said. He basically said, if staff wear masks, he feels like that they'll be sufficiently protected, even if students are not wearing masks. If we socially distance, that's what he's saying. He's saying that for two reasons. One is because he doesn't think that kids will wear them with fidelity, but two, their infection rates are so low. I think what physicians are learning as the COVID-19 pandemic goes on and they have more data, the infection rate for students is pretty low, both in terms of their infection rate, but also their carrier rate. And he feels like the best protection for adults who are at more risk is to wear a face covering. He feels they'll be sufficiently protected if we do some social distancing. He thinks the benefits of having kids wear masks and requiring it doesn't gain you much benefit. He thinks it should be encouraged and applauded and celebrated and provided, and not necessarily required, particularly for kids 5th grade and younger.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of what he's thinking. So the protection is, he does think there's some sense for adults to wear it.
Okay.
And
I'm thinking, though, as a suggestion that particular nuance needs to be explained to our community.
yeah, I think if we land, no matter where we land, and that's a great point, Wes, no matter where we land, messaging that talks about our process, well, briefly talks about our process and the science and the data that we use to make those decisions will be so critically important. You're absolutely right, 100%.
Yes.
It's an excellent point. Thanks
Yeah.
for asking that question.
Great. Yeah, I think with the medical checks, I think that is also an opportunity for ongoing sort of culture shifting too. The fact that like daily everybody coming into the building is saying, I'm feeling well, and it is something, that's not going to be fail safe, and I think there was some discussion amongst the staff last week around just worrying about the honesty, maybe of some folks in filling that out themselves, but I do think it is an opportunity for that kind of ongoing culture change, and I did hear the staff, wonder about masks potentially becoming a discipline issue, but I do actually have now heard the superintendent talk about health checks potentially being a staff disciplinary, challenge too, around really making sure our staff are in the spirit of not showing up sick to work. This is a real expectation now. We've all done it before, but we're not going to do it moving forward. So yeah, I think that'll be a good just check on the culture as well.
If I could strike an optimistic tone,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hopeful that wherever we land with all of these mitigating measures, not just face coverings and screenings, but the cleaning, the hand sanitizing, and being more mindful, that I think my optimistic tone is that that'll also help us during the flu season and
Yes.
other maladies that we struggle with every year because people aren't so mindful. I just kind of wonder if we'll gain some residual benefit in other things that come up during the course of 180 school days that we struggle with because we're being more mindful of washing our hands, hand sanitizing, social distancing, some face coverings, all those things. I hope so, because it's certainly a difficult mind shift for us. So that's my optimistic tone today.
Yeah, it's my understanding that all childhood illnesses communicable illnesses are down right now because we're not just preventing COVID by these practices, we're preventing a heck of a lot of other things. So yeah, that's a great point.
And I think one of the things that that'll be messaged out, and this will be part of the messaging, is while school attendance is always important, it's going to be we're going to have different expectations for families, and not be so punitive and
Yes.
about school attendance, and not necessarily create those celebrations this year about perfect attendance, because that's not really our goal this year. Our goal is to be safe And so, because I know that we'll have longer times that we ask students to stay away from school if they have a fever. The prior protocol was 24 hours, but that might increase to 72. We don't want to penalize those students. Not only do we want to celebrate good, healthy decisions, but we want to like make sure they have access to their work while they're out if we're asking them to stay home. So, but those will be some things that will be laid out as we get closer to making those final details.
Yeah. And this may come up in the implications conversation, but I know one of the topics that got raised kind of toward the end of the staff call last week was a worry about folks who maybe don't have the sick days necessary to take time. And so, you know, if there is some sort of budget or policy implication for us, you know, I certainly don't want folks to be nickel and diming their days off if they are truly, you know, in need of sick time. I can't speak for my, you know, my fellow board members yet, but I think, you know, that's something that will have an implication and is something that we can be mindful of.
That's a great point. I agree with that, Katie. But I also would like to add something that I think Vince just touched on, which rung a bell. Maybe others have considered it already. How will it affect our average daily attendance if we happen to have a fairly good number of kids collectively, aggregately absent? And how will that affect budget? And I mean, how is Desi said anything about anything like that?
It's going to be mid to late July probably before we know much about what that looks like. I suspect that it'll be relaxed a bit, but we don't know what or how.
And then the other part that we have to consider is who is in schools, not necessarily in the physical space. It's also a virtual space that has to be considered, and it really hasn't been figured out how they're going to do that across the board, because we all have different learning platforms. So not everyone really knows, so they don't know is the answer to that.
It's also a little bit more long-term than that, Wes, as our state formula payments are for last year. So everything's delayed a whole year. So it's kind of weird. I won't get into the intricacies of it, but that's essentially what happens is we're being paid for what happened this time last year, not this year. So next year, this time we'll be reaping the benefits or not benefits of what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
Right. I understand. Right.
And what the state has said on that, they're trying to make it to where we can use a different year and hold us a little bit more harmless than perhaps could be. So they are looking for ways to ease some of that burden.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on to the learning plan? Okay, so Roxana did an outstanding job of going into all the details, but now we have more of a macro follow-up for you all to like clearly consider, or her developing recommendations for the board. So Roxana, you can go ahead.
Sure. So I won't go back through everything I did last time, thankfully, right? But there is a three-tier process. So a couple high-level things that we are going to have to think about, and I think we're very close to having thought through and making some recommendations. We talked a lot about learning platforms and about needing to be fluid and having a blended approach all year long with students using It's Learning when they're on site, also when they're off site, because we think that situation will be fluid. One of the things that I've been talking with the principals about, though, is what if we do have some families who don't want to send their children to us at all? Right? It's Learning will work great for students that are planning blended, that will be with us sometimes and not sometimes. If a family chooses not to send their students to us at all, currently, we have very limited options. Telling the family that they can homeschool, which means that they are in essence disenrolling their child from us, would be an option. expecting our teachers to come up with some kind of independent study, which is very time consuming and labor intensive, and also would fragment kind of the teacher's attention on their current caseload, then students they never see. So one of the things we've been exploring that looks to be a fairly cost-effective option is a program called, it's run out of the University of Missouri-Columbia, called the Academy. And basically they are offering a virtual curriculum. We would pay a membership fee. We would own the platform and run it. So it would be an MRH teacher. But essentially what we'd be doing is asking parents to make a decision whether they were going to send students to us on-site or blended, or whether they do not want them to attend classes at all. And once they made that decision would have to stand for probably a semester. Think about a quarter, but probably a semester. What that would do for us is it would, in essence, put those students in a different environment with a different teacher on a different platform so that they don't get confused and commingled with our blended learning students. That should provide clarity both for families and for our teachers, because the teacher or teachers that would manage the academy would know that they were using the MU curriculum. They would have a clear path forward, and they know what that means. Everyone that remains with us in a blended format would be in MRH curriculum, working on MRH objectives, and that would give us enough separation with the different styles of learning, I suppose, or what that might mean, that we provide clarity for both parties and help us to be better able to support. So that's something that preliminarily we think is a good idea, particularly for our K-6 families, because that looks very different, and we've talked ad nauseum about how hard that is to run a platform for early learners. So we do want to be able to serve those families, but we also have to be able to manage it, which was something that I mentioned to you last time. So that's a new thing that we've run across, and we can talk more about costs and what that might mean at a future meeting. But that is something we will have to decide, and we'll have to decide probably by mid-July, mid to late July, because we'd have to have families start making decisions. And then if we know which families are not coming on site, that also eases our social distancing. We can plan classrooms a little better, okay? Also, moving on just a little bit, so that was a new wrinkle. We've established what needs to happen for teacher training for the blended It's Learning piece. We talked all about that last time. I won't go over that again. We have, Cindy and I sat today and we went through preliminary spaces for her building. She does have to do some follow-up with Amber and the architects, but we do believe, based on what we currently know, that if we did not have the First Friends program, we could accommodate all pre-K through second grade learners on site. What would have to happen is that the specialists would have to travel to the classrooms. We would create safety by creating cohorts of kids. So there would be approximately 15 kids that would stay together all day long. They would eat in their classroom. In a tier 2 environment, they would go to recess as a group. So there would be no commingling. So the risk would be relatively small, even if they weren't exactly 6 feet apart at all times, which we know young children may not do. We'd have staggered start and stop time. So we've talked through all of that. We feel like we have a pretty good plan, but we do need both the teachers and the space that First Friends is currently taking up in order to make that work. So one of the things that she would need from you is the go ahead to do that at some future date, and what that means in terms of contacting families. But as of right now, looking at all of our spaces, the teachers that we have available, and how we could reconfigure literally every spot in her building, we do believe that that can happen even if we have all of our kids. But let's say we had 20 to 30% of parents that don't send their kids to school, that frees up even more room that would allow that plan to work. So that's new information for you about that. The other thing I did want to say is, after talking to the principals and with Rachel Ward, we are going to recommend that we not do fall Aspire testing. That's our national norm test, but we didn't do MAP testing, and we usually use the fall Aspire as a comparison, so we have nothing to compare to. And it's going to be a fairly intensive time for students as we begin to compact standards and move forward, and that's just time taken away from learning that we don't think would be worth the return in this particular environment. So that is my alternative learning report, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and then I've got a few comments about HR. also.
How quickly do you feel like we need to make a decision about First Friends?
Well, I was talking to Cindy today. You know, she would like sooner rather than later because she needs to contact families and she feels like she needs to help folks with some alternatives, and so she doesn't want anybody being surprised at the last minute. We are proceeding with planning in terms of the conversations we're having with that as a possibility. But if we decide not to do that, then that means that we have to go back and rethink several spaces. So I don't know that, you know, there's a fire for the decision, but soon or sooner, certainly by early July.
I think it's more about informing our families. We know what the budgetary impact will be, but I know Cindy's worked through some, I haven't said it before, she's a mastermind over there.
Yes, she is.
Moves those pieces around. It really is something to behold. I'm not even being funny about that. But she has a sketch of a plan on how we would be able to repurpose and shift things around with those First Friends teachers currently, so that we can not just have those staff. We'd be able to repurpose them is what I'm trying to get at. So while that will be a financial impact, it will give us a greater opportunity to space out the PK kids and make good use of our certified staff.
Do we know or anticipate we will know what the budgetary impact of that Mizzou online program
Yes.
would look like?
We have to buy a license for use of the content and the platform. So for all K-12 curricula, that license costs $10,000. We then would have to buy. We would then have to buy increments based on how many families we were serving. So worst case scenario, that's probably about $15,000, which sounds like a lot, but if we're having to buy teachers, you know, our own teachers to write our curriculum, we'll have to dedicate at least one staff member, but that's still significantly less than if we were trying to hire people, write our own, and maintain our own platform through the closure. So that's actually the choice, I think, that most districts, while not everybody's using the MU Academy, that is the choice that most districts are making to deal with the issue of families who simply do not want to send their children to school, because it will be very chaotic to have all of that mixed in with the day-to-day and the blended. So
are they capping like the amount of attendance in that type of program, or just kind of?
So we have to buy the license for the spacing, and then there are attendance caps by which you would pay the additional increments. But for that price, our teachers also have a go-to person there that they can talk with every couple days, that will mentor them through, that will help them with technical difficulties. So it really does, in terms of the burden on our staff, it really does offload a lot of worries that we would have to have tech people involved in, curriculum people involved in, principals involved in. It should be a well-supported kind of alternative experience if folks really don't feel comfortable sending their children back to school.
Roxana, I know all this is new. You said we would be buying those seats basically in blocks.
You buy the license, and then up to 300 students, I think it is. I think it's like an additional $1,500 for every 300 students or 4 teachers. So
it's fairly reasonable cost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll be doing some more investigation, so we'll see how that comes about. Are we ready to hear about HR briefly? So as you're aware, and some of you have already mentioned, there are lots of HR considerations in all of this. You know, things as mundane as making sure we've got updated emergency contacts, all of the required training we're having to put out. But incidentally, central office folks came back into the building today, so making sure they're watching training videos, making sure they understand about the mask wearing and the social distancing and all of those things. But also I'm working pretty closely with our contractors, most notably Kelly, as we think about rules for substitutes. We are anticipating a higher than average need for subs next year. So thinking about what that might mean, thinking about making sure that our business rules and our training rules are also replicated with staff that are regularly in our building. And actually, Kelly's fairly easy to work with, but we also sub out nurses. We have had sub food service workers, and so all of those groups will have to be contacted and made sure that they are following whatever guidance we ultimately end up with. In addition, we are inserting clauses in all of our extra duty agreement that provide language that allows us some variance and leeways if we would go into another stay-at-home order, or if those services cannot be provided, then we will have a clause on the agreement saying that, you know, they can be terminated at any time based on community conditions. And I think folks are very understanding of that. Most of the ones that we write are hourly anyway, so if they're not logging hours, they're not being paid, but some things don't work that way. And then Katie brought up the big consideration, which is very difficult to think about, and that is, how do we handle employees who need to stay home that have exhausted all of their leave, right? I will say that 99% of our staff are very conscientious, and the problem we most often have is they come to work when they should have stayed home and they have plenty of leave, they're just showing up. Those cases are easy. Plus we have the 2 weeks of COVID emergency leave, plus we have 12 weeks of the COVID FML. So, so far we've been able to use combinations of personal leave and the emergency leave and handle everything that's come up. But in the next year, I am anticipating that we will have scenarios by which folks may have exhausted leave and we need them to stay home, or we want them to stay home, or we have a situation, obviously, if we believe they've been exposed at our work site and we need them to self-quarantine, that we would cover the leave, even if that were an administrative decision and they were out of leave. The situation that's more troubling is based on personal choices. If we're exposed somewhere externally and now we have to go into a 14-day quarantine, and if that happens repeatedly and there is no leave, currently under our existing policy, that would be an unpaid leave. Right? So I've talked to HR folks all over the state, and the most frequent response I get about how we're handling this is folks are saying they're using their existing leave policies, which would be almost identical to ours, which means we would require them to, you know, burn their leave, give them any of the leaves that would apply to them, do an interactive process to determine if it was health related and if we could make any kind of accommodation, including work from home or other work that could be provided that would be more isolated. And then when we get to the end of that process, allow them to take the leave without penalty but unpaid. So that's currently what we have in HR to work with. Obviously, if it's a work site exposure issue, I believe we would cover that leave and use administrative leave if that was what, you know, what we could handle. But I do anticipate, and Karen and I have talked about this at length, this is not going to be an easy year. Also considering every time that happens, we have subs, we have sub costs, we have sub shortages in the building, which means as we're thinking about that, we also have to think about, you know, do we need to have TAs on site that could sub when we have unfilled sub days, which is going to happen. And typically in a normal year, we would just combine classes and make do and get through it. We will not be able to do that in a tier 2 setting where we've got kids in cohorts that can't commingle because we can't guarantee the 6-foot distance variance necessarily in a ECC classroom. So trying to figure out how we're going to cover subs and how we're going to cover leave is a significant decision and does have policy implications for the board. I am not suggesting we have unlimited leave because I do believe that we couldn't afford it, number one, and two, I think it leaves us open to abuse. So there's that. Whatever we do land on has to be put in the employee handbook. And to your point, Francis, if we're requiring staff to do things, we have to handbook what it is we're requiring them to do, and then that would bound us to provide certain items and to make sure that conditions were okay. So we're looking at that as well. Some things that we also have to think about is who is the point person that we are requiring staff members to self-report to if they have COVID or symptoms. Currently that's me, and I'm fine for that to continue, but we also have to have a point person for students and families. And so currently that is undefined. I nominate Vince Estrada, but he may not agree. Sorry, I had to say that just for a little moment. We do need to think about that. And then we also have to think about what the communication channels are. Obviously, if there's symptoms, people want to know lots of stuff, but we can't share much. So knowing what we can share and when we will, the conditions under which we will share it and the conditions under which we will not, that all needs to be very clear. I feel like we have a fairly clear process, but making sure all that's in the handbook and that everybody agrees that is the correct procedure would be important. And that's kind of all I have for right now.
Thank you, Roxana.
Sorry, I have another question. To the whole point about, you know, we will be using more subs this year. We, you know, anticipate that there will be more staff absences this year. What have the conversations been around professional development opportunities that would typically have taken staff out of the building during the day? Just wondering if that's been discussed.
Well, yes, we are trying to determine how we think about after school options, how we think about, obviously there are some things that staff will be unwise to leave staff untrained in some instances, but we also know that we can't have a bunch of folks out of the building if we need them to cover kids. So we are planning for limited number of staff training. We'll also be converting some things to other formats so that folks can do them in different ways. So I suspect it will be a combination, and we'll have to continually assess community conditions and what the sub availability is as we move forward.
I mean, and if that's another policy that needs like a emergency, you know, edit for this school year or something, you know, I could imagine us putting some sort of, you know, hold on external professional development this year, or, you know, again, not in perpetuity and not because we're not trying to make sure that our staff are super well trained, but I think because of the just the challenges that COVID is going to present.
I will say on the professional development piece, DESE has waived the 1% requirement this year. I don't believe that decision's yet been made for the next fiscal year, but my assumption is that if anything similar to what we're experiencing now reoccurs, that they would also do that. But otherwise, we would be statutorily bound to spend 1% of our budget on PD.
Do we need to set aside a place in the budget for extraordinary expenditures due to COVID related to personnel and other issues?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do, and yes, I have.
Very good.
Is that where we're moving to next?
Yeah.
The next
Nice segue, Wes.
Gosh, it felt like we planned that or something, right? Do you want me to move on with the money stuff?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. So starting with buildings and grounds, we know that there will be, there's some additions that Amber's made to the budget. So things to scrub things better. So some machinery to better clean some of our spaces, specifically our restrooms. Virus protection, that's both PPE and chemicals and cleaning supplies, as well as some allowance for engineering controls. I know that SM Wilson has come in and walked the spaces and has made some recommendations, and she's working with them to get a clear idea on what that looks like. So those things in total at this point in time are about $52,000. Moving on to the technology side, I've added a complete grade level worth of Chromebooks, so that'll allow us to make sure that there's a device that can go home with every kid, K-12. We were there numbers-wise this year, but we weren't really set up infrastructure-wise to make that happen in any meaningful or efficient way. So we had to not do that. But that's also involved the purchasing of laptop cases for the grades that have not traditionally taken their devices home, which is grades K through 5. We were able to use some of the ESSER funds to make that purchase ready this fiscal year. So I've got a room full of laptop cases ready to accept the Chromebooks as soon as we make that decision. There's also been some talk about these Swivel Robots. So we've allocated budget for 48 of these devices. It's actually a pretty cool technology. Teacher wears a fob around their neck, and you put some type of mobile recording device. In this case, we would probably use an iPod Touch. It seems to be the most robust and least expensive. The balance between robust equipment and cost effectiveness. So both of those two costs are $46,000. But what this would allow us to do is teachers to record their in-person lessons so that they could then post them to their plans to provide for students that may not be able. And consequently, if that happens to not be the case, we can always use those for coaching opportunities, which is how they're currently being used on a small scale at the elementary and ECC this past school year. So altogether, it's $46,000. Chromebook cases I've already mentioned that totaled about $17,000 additional to what I would typically spend. That total bill came up to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 25, but 17 of that was specifically for the K-12. Then I always hold back a certain amount, and that number moves around a little bit based on some of the variables I see back in the business office for COVID itself, because I know that there's things that we're not going to think of that are going to cost money. I've allocated $55,000 for that contingency. Now, Wes, to your point, that does not include staffing. Roxana and I have to have a sober conversation about what that looks like this week. So you see me rubbing my temples. So sorry, tuck that in. We will talk about those things and get a little bit clearer picture on what those numbers, and I can probably be able to get that to you Thursday at the budget meeting. So again, for that COVID contingency, $55,000 for those unforeseen things. And if we don't spend it, that's great. It's just money that we won't spend. Summer staffing for the food service employees, that's already baked into the budget. We've already made that adjustment, but that totals about $15,000 for the labor hours in order to do that. And then we have the in-class food service. So this one's a little bit more complicated just because there's quite a bit of equipment that's involved. In order to pull this off at all three of our buildings, we're going to need to buy some pretty expensive stuff to do the in-class service. And right now I've got that contingency set at $30,000. Irene's done a good job of getting some quotes on that type of the equipment to keep that food hot as it's being served in the classrooms. If you've been in a hospital when they bring the food carts around and the insulated things, that's kind of what we're talking about. Well, they will bring the hot stuff up and then plate it with the cold stuff and then serve it to the kids in the classroom. So all total, we're just shy of $250,000. 246 is the exact number. But again, that number is subject to change as we learn more and as we adjust up or down based on what we're seeing in the country as well as the community.
Chris. I know that we applied for some CARES funding though through DESE. Are the costs you just outlined things that we're hoping to receive through that or out of our own budget?
So of that 246, it's a good point. We'll be able to recapture between 90 and 100,000 of that directly through the CARES funding. That is a we spend, they reimburse scenario. So we've already made one drawdown on that. We're in the process of making that one drawdown for those laptop cases. That's all we're going to be able to get in. That's a sizable purchase for this fiscal year. Once July hits, we've got some other things that we can roll into that. And then also two things that I'm going to I was holding the space bar down. I needed both hands. There are two things that we're applying for this week through the county. Also ESSER funds through the CARES Act. But one of those is the Humanitarian Assistance Fund, and then also the Child Care Fund. There's monies allocated there. There's pretty specific rules. The reporting requirements aren't awesome, but they're not awful. So Cindy and I are sitting down in the morning to go through the preschool to see if there's what costs we can allocate to some of those things. And then there's significant technology funding that we can apply for through that humanitarian needs fund. So one of those is due on Wednesday, and the other is due at the end of the month. So they are reviewing and awarding those things in July. So by July 10th, we should have an idea of exactly what the dollar amount would be. The childcare one's a little bit more straightforward. It's based on your enrollment. So the tier that we would fall in would be $7,000 a month for 3 months. So totaling $21,000. However, again, that's another thing where if they would give us that lump sum and we would reimburse them for whatever we didn't expend. And like I said, the list of things that are eligible to use that funding on it's pretty finite. So we would have to be very, very careful about how we, let's say Amber made a large cleaning purchase. We would have to line item out the items that we would use for the preschool so that we could make sure that we were properly accounting, because we would need to report those things on the end of each month. And all funds would need to be dispersed and spent by December of 2020.
All right. Other questions or concerns here? All right, great. I know we have our budget session on Thursday, and then we'll have another opportunity to talk about the budget at the end of this month too, as we transition from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21. So thanks, Chris, and really everybody on the admin team for thinking forward about those costs. All right. Shall we move on to that last agenda item here, Karen? Thanks.
Yeah. Did you want to set that up? Because I know we kind of
Sure.
touched base on that about the culture.
Yeah, so I mean, and I know last week this was also something that Francis hit upon a couple of times during the work session. It's something that I've been hearing in some of the conversations that I've been privy to as well. But obviously there is no normal to go back to. We are establishing a new normal, and as such, there's going to be, it's like any new habit, right? You've got to work at it to establish it as a new habit. We've obviously talked about the idea of, again, we've all done it. We've all gone to work sick before when we probably should have stayed home. And I think a bulletin or a notice in the employee handbook one time at the beginning of the calendar year is not going to be enough for this new habit to sink in, right? So I think certainly wanted to talk a little bit with Ed and the rest of the admin team about the possibility of both additional communications internally within the district, to our staff, as well as communications to our families and our students. I've heard a few things on the staff calls about new signage. I've heard things about, the desire to use the robocall technology in some different ways, a variety of ideas there. And so wanted to potentially hear what we're thinking about that and potentially source some additional ideas or thoughts from the board as well. As we know, as many communication channels as we have within the district, those still, hit some people and don't hit others, and are never fully foolproof in getting our messages out. But this year we have a lot of additional messages to cut through the noise and get to people. So.
Ed, do you want to share kind of what you're hearing from your colleagues around this communication and re-education?
Yeah, so we're in communication almost on a daily basis, and we share notes about mostly external communication because that presents the most challenges, obviously. But there's kind of a consensus that when families are hearing from the administrator who deals most closely with their students, that's where awareness and responsiveness is highest by far. And we've learned that in the past year. Whether it was accidental or not, our greatest communications innovation was giving all of our principals, and in fact, Karen as well, their own newsletter platform via Constant Contact. And like I said, the read rate, as we call it, and the response rate to those is so much higher than some message that just comes from that guy in Central Office. Right now, it looks unanimous that the regional districts are all going to have some kind of solid message on or by July 20th. Districts are in various stages of still putting together timelines for their messages. I've got a rough outline, which I was going to share with you on Thursday. It's fairly complicated. But that's where we are right now, is still, everybody's still in that stage where we're waiting for additional guidance from the state before we can be very specific to families. And that's what families want right now, is specifics. We get that. Just last week, when we sent the survey out to the families, the staff, and the students, it was prefaced by a couple of paragraphs which synopsized, what we're doing right now. This is what each department of the district is doing right now. We're not sitting back. We're 24/7 almost here, thinking about your kids in the fall. So hope that helps a little.
Ed, do you anticipate needing some additional people power to, push these newsletters from admin? Like I said, I know we're used to only getting robocalls around, snow closures, but, wondering about, more frequent use of that technology, more frequent use of, just other vehicles too. Are there cost implications that we're thinking about for increased communication?
I wouldn't say that there are. I've got the people and the tools I need. It's just making sure that we're taking the most advantage. A robocall only gets you so far. With a robocall, it's challenging to craft a message to a family who's not wired. If they're not connected, well, they're going to get your robocall, but maybe it's going to be harder for them to provide you feedback. So, I've been thinking as well about in whatever form they might take place, but the family orientation weeks, the parent nights that are coming up, late in the summer. So there's an opportunity. And like you said already, Katie, the meal service is going to be continuing. There's going to be a short break, I think, in July, but it'll continue after that into August. So we just have to be crafty and creative with the channels, the conduits that we do have.
And we have to be consistent.
Yeah.
It has to be concise, it has to be consistent, and just not to let up in any way, and just different. And like you said, you have to be creative.
Two things I would add. We've also had conversations about how we can use our virtual home visits this summer to share important information. So Ed, I assume you and I will be working together to help give them some talking points, because we know when we do those virtual home visits, families are going to have questions, and we hope to be able to answer many of them in that platform. Also, one tool that we're using for staff that are returning to work, we do have the Safe Schools website, which is where we do all our required training. So we do have a pretty good series of very short COVID-related videos that we're assigning to staff as they're returning to work in spaces based on, you know, their job description. So those are a couple other things that we're also doing.
The one other thing, I think this may have actually come up as a suggestion from PTO, but we know obviously our board meetings are a great way for us to have conversation, but aren't necessarily a space to have conversation with our community. And, you know, would like to maybe chew on the idea of creating some space for, you know, have coffee with a board member or two where folks could, you know, ask questions and have a bit of a dialogue. I think a lot of times the questions that are bubbling up on social media right now are things that we know the answers to and discussed in public sessions. But, you know, if someone isn't already planning to be on our meetings or doesn't have a direct line to one of the 7 of us, I think that's potentially an opportunity to do things that could be, you know, again, fairly low touch, but an opportunity for creating a bit more transparency. So that's just a thought too. I'm happy to hear, you know, folks' reactions tonight to that, or, you know, we can revisit that in the coming days as well.
Okay, I like that idea. When I took my training with MSBA, they called those listening sessions, and said that it was a good idea so community members could talk directly to their board directors, you know, without having to, I don't know, wait for a meeting to make public comment. So I like the idea.
Yeah, I know we can't recreate the baseball state, you know, fan section for Maria to get, you know, feedback from parents, but maybe we can create some sort of virtual opportunity for that sort of casual conversation and an opportunity to ask questions. All right. Other thoughts or hopes for the communications pieces? Any other questions that have occurred to folks during the evening that you haven't asked yet? All right, we have a couple of items in executive session then. So can I have a motion to go into executive session?
Motion to go into executive session.
Thanks, Ralph.
Second.
Thank you, Brandy. Sorry, Nikki, you weren't fast enough on the unmute.
Sorry, y'all.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All right, great. Thank you so much. We'll reconvene about real estate matters here momentarily.
All right.